Good evening, and welcome to Politico's Election Night Live and our special live taping of the EU Confidential podcast. I don't know about you, but I'm psyched for tonight. We live for elections here at Politico, and tonight we get the results of 27 all at once. After 5 years, the European Parliament election has the potential to shake up everything here in Brussels. Who's up? Who's down? Is this right-wing surge we've all been hearing about actually happening? And what does it all mean? I'm Sarah Wheaton, your host for the evening, and together with my colleagues, we'll be walking you through the results we know so far and decoding the messages that voters have sent to the most powerful people in Brussels. There'll also be a good dose of speculation, informed speculation, of course, about how this tips the balance of power here in Brussels and shifts the agenda, or doesn't. As we speak, the votes are being counted and the exit polls are coming in. And we'll get to those numbers soon enough. But first, let me just kind of walk you through the plan for this evening. In a moment, we'll talk about those numbers with Hanna Kokolari, our polling expert here at Politico. I'll also be bringing in a policy editor, Lawrence Rulis, to help us talk through the big policy issues that actually affect our lives. And we'll also check in with top political reporters, Barbara Moons and Eddie Wax. And in this live recording, we've got a little bit of an echo. As soon as they are ready, we will bring them in. So now, let me call in, now that we've got that dealt with, let me ask my boss to come in, Jamil Anderlini, our editor-in-chief. He's going to help us look at the big picture. And while he's joining me here in the studio, I want to let you know that you can ask questions on Slido. Use the hashtag EU election night. And I'll try to check in with your questions. And you know, I'm kind of a stickler for transparency. And so I'm much more likely to ask and get answers to questions that include the name and the organization of the person who's asking a question. And hopefully we can deal with this echo.
Yeah, can you guys fix the echo? Thank you.
Well, Jamil, we're doing a live broadcast. Sometimes we have interesting technical situations.
Yes, we do. I'm sure we'll fix the echo in a second. But hi, Sarah. How are you?
I'm good. I can see that we've got some early results coming in. And broadly, I'm going to check with my studio about if I should ask a substantial question or just keep going forward. We're going to keep going forward. Cool.
Okay, but can we fix the echo? Thank you very much.
So we don't have the full results, but what are we getting a sense of at this point?
It's very clear that Europe is shifting to the right. It's just obvious from the earliest results that we were getting from the very beginning. We could see that the far right in particular have done extra well, and they've done particularly well in France. And this is crushing for French President Emmanuel Macron to have less than half his party, the parties he's affiliated with in the EU election, have gotten less than half what the far right National Rally party of Marine Le Pen and Jordan Bardella have got tonight, according to the earliest polls that we have. But we expect that to be basically the result. So across Europe, we're seeing a rightward shift, and in particular in France, a crushing rightward shift.
Yeah. And, you know, Politico ran a headline last week anticipating if this is Europe's Trump moment. How are you feeling about that headline now? Do you think it's bearing out?
Yeah, I think you could, we'll have to see the final results, but you could definitely make an argument that that Europe is reaping the results of years of ignoring the kind of left behind fringe people on the fringes who've missed out on the sort of neoliberal world order, the era of open borders, of green policies, of elite-led political liberal ideas. Many people across Europe feel they've missed out on this globalization, let's say, and they're voting against the elites in particular.
And I remember I was a political reporter in the US in 2016. There was this sort of soul searching when Trump won and people didn't predict it within the media, of wondering if we have covered properly exactly those groups of people that you were just talking about. What has your sort of strategy been at Politico as far as our coverage leading up to the election to make sure we're capturing different cohorts of voters?
I would say at Politico we're privileged and fortunate in the fact that we are avowedly nonpartisan. So as a political news organization, we are not on the left, on the right, supporting any candidates. We are here just to report on what happens and report on the facts. So whereas some of our competitors, I would say, in the media are to a certain extent blinded by their ideological prisms, we don't have that. I think it's impossible to remove that entirely at the individual reporter level, but at an institutional level, as Politico, we just don't have that position where we're coming from the left or the right. So I think we've been able to genuinely cover the lead up to this election based on the facts that we see. As Deng Xiaoping said, we seek truth from facts.
Great. All right. Well, Jamil, thank you so much for joining us, helping us kick things off. We'll see you again in a few minutes to get a better sense of the results.
Thank you, Sarah.
And now joining me is Hannah Kokalere, our top polling expert here at Politico. And while Hannah gets set up, I'll just remind you that you can ask us questions over Slido using the hashtag #EUElectionNight. Hannah, thank you so much for joining me.
Thanks for having me.
I hope you're adjusting okay to the echo. We're enjoying it here.
It's unusual.
Yes. So give us a sense of what we know at this point. The results are still kind of rolling in.
Yeah, you're asking us at a really good time because just a few minutes ago we really didn't have a full picture of the hemicycle yet. Luckily, we just received our first projection, so we have slightly more data now. We're still very much digesting them, though. As you can tell, it actually shows behind you as well. You see that EPP is still projected to be the largest group, and SND still the second largest. But I've ran the numbers a little bit. The EPP seems to actually get slightly stronger. The SND slightly weaker. Renew as well, compared with the full number of MEPs, because the parliament is set to grow as well, right? From 705 MEPs to 720.
Exactly. And so as far as individual countries, which ones are we getting a sense of, whether through exit polls or through actual results coming in?
So one of the first large countries that we got first estimates from is Germany. That's, of course, a very telling country, because there's been a lot of attention going to Alternative for Germany, of course, there, and the rise as one example of the rise of far-right parties across Europe. And you do see that they appear to have made some large gains there. But the Christian Democrats are still by far the largest party there.
And then Jamil mentioned France. What are we getting a sense of there?
Yes, there's been an exit poll of Ipsos which suggests that the Rassemblement National, so National Rally of Bardella,
and Le Pen.
And Le Pen, yes, has gotten about 30% of the vote, which would give them major gains in the European Parliament as well. So that's one example of a far-right party expected to make large gains and actually appearing to make large gains as well. I have added up the numbers of the far-right family in the European Parliament. We have a first projection. You see that there is a big section of the European Parliament that is still unfilled. It's new parties that aren't really affiliated with anyone, and and you have some far-right parties also hiding in the non-aligned group. So you can't necessarily tell who they're aligned with. But if you just add up what we currently have in terms of estimates for the European Conservatives and Reformists, and then also ID, then you get to 133 MEPs If you add AfD, Alternative for Germany, who are currently non-aligned, to that, then you get to 149. If you assume that Bulgaria's revival would sympathize with them, then you get to 152. So we are talking about a fairly sizable part of the European Parliament that could broadly be defined as far-right, if not allied in a super group.
Yeah. And can you walk us through a little bit, just kind of what you're doing tonight? How are you going through and collecting results?
Oh, hell yeah. It's a chaotic evening, really. I'm just looking at every result coming in and trying to see the big shifts on a national level and also what that might mean on the EU level. There are a lot of moving parts, so it's kind of hard to really have a clear picture right now. But you do, obviously, on national level, based on these first estimates that can change, of course, throughout the night and maybe even in the next days. But you can see some shifts.
Mm-hmm. What do you mean the next days? How will the results kind of roll in? We're not going to just get everything tonight?
No. We're getting projections, estimates, some final results throughout the night, but I think results will be officialized in the next days.
Okay. All right. Man, I hate having to wait. We also, one of the first votes that we did have happen was in the Netherlands.
Yes.
And that it seems like that kind of set the stage for these broader trends that we're seeing.
In a way, yes, and in a way also no, because we've seen this huge gain for far-right, Geert Wilders' far-right Freedom Party in the November election, and he's still polling miles ahead when it comes to national voting intentions. However, when you look at EU polling and also the exit poll, he was a clear winner, of course. He had no real MEPs, and he is now projected to get 7. That's a massive leap. But then the alliance of the socialists and the Green Left are projected to get 8. They celebrated that as a win. Of course, they're gonna have to distribute those MEPs over different political groups. So the Wilders' Identity and Democracy MEPs will still outnumber them in terms of political family. But in that sense, his win was smaller than some had feared. Then again, if you look at France, that doesn't seem to be the case. The national rally of Bardella and Marine Le Pen, as you said, do seem to be delivering on their projected wins.
Mm-hmm. Well, I remember you and I were talking ahead of the vote about the Netherlands, and you had talked about why we might actually see in that country a difference in sort of results between the national election and the European election.
Yes.
It seems like that maybe did bear out a bit.
Yes, I was actually really fascinated by that. How because very often you'll see that that the EU election is kind of treated like another national parliament election. In a way, of course, you can argue that's still the case. Maybe people are reacting to the election last year, but you did see the national voting intentions veering very much in favor of Wilders' Freedom Party, and then the EU voting intention having them neck and neck with the Socialists and Green Left, which happened. Turnout plays a
I was going to say, yeah. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you. Continue,
turnout plays a massive role. If you saw what Wilders was trying to do and has, to a certain extent, managed to do, he had one massive challenge, and it was getting his voters to actually cast a vote. And it appears he's managed to a certain extent, but I think, and I might misremember, but I think 56% of his voters in November still stayed home. So that of course plays a major role, and however much the EU institutions celebrate every advance in turnout on the EU level, last time around it was 50% across Europe, and that includes some countries that have compulsory voting. In the Netherlands, just 42% voted in 2019. This time around it appears to be like 46, 47%. That's more. It's not a lot, though.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and in this case, perhaps pro-European parties are benefiting from lower turnout.
Exactly, certainly. Lower turnout maybe in the opposing camp and high turnout in theirs, because and again, I hope I don't misremember this, but I think among the the left-wing alliance of socialists and Green Left, they had a far higher turnout among their voters.
Mm-hmm. All right, well, Hannah, we know that you have a ton of number crunching to do tonight, so I'm going to let you get back to it. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
All right, so as Hannah ducks out, I'm going to invite back in my editor-in-chief, Jamil Anderlini, and policy reporter, Lawrence Rulis. And as they get situated, let me remind you that we have a possibility for you to ask questions on Slido. So head over there with the hashtag EU Election Night. Lawrence, Jamil, thanks for joining us. Conditions are a little better since you were last here, Jamil. And Lawrence, thanks for being here.
Thanks a lot, Sarah.
Lawrence, let me start with you. You are kind of one of our gurus at Politico for, one of our biggest geeks, actually. Guru is a nice euphemism for geek, for really having watched these elections closely over the decades. What stands out to you most so far about this year?
I'll take geek, I'll take guru.
Thank you.
It is true that it's my third European Parliament election that I'm covering as a journalist. So the first one was 2014. And 2019 was the last one. I think what I'm seeing right now is we've had a big discussion in Europe about the rise of the far right. And I think this is a narrative that's gone back 10 years, 20 years. It is something that's been sort of looming across the bloc. What we're seeing now with this election specifically is that narrative of a surging far right has reached a certain tipping point. So we are at the point where the right-wing forces, everything from sort of the hard right and far right and everything in between, has sort of reached a point where they have a substantial block of seats, but they're also willing to use it. They are willing to engage in power. They are willing to actually play ball when it comes to European politics. And that fundamentally shifts where the European Union can go in the next 5 years. I think that's one of the major takeaways. Obviously, the big question is going to be how exactly this group of right-wing voters' seats, how exactly they are going to manifest their power. And there, I think you can have a lot of different strategies, and this is something we do not yet know. But up until now, the far right especially has been obstructive. They've had a strategy of blockage. A lot of times, these were parties that were also campaigning on exiting the European Union. That sort of narrative we've seen toned down, and now we're dealing with parties that are just as interesting in terms of where they are on the political spectrum, but they are more engaged. They are actually in the EU politics machine, and so to the mainstream parties in the center, it becomes more difficult, but also more interesting to actually engage with these parties and actually see what kind of politics we can get out of it. If I can just point out one more thing, it's turnout. Turnout is always an interesting figure in the European Parliament elections. There is sort of a long-standing issue with the European Union that it's had a hard time connecting with its citizens. It's had a hard time selling its story of the European Union. It looks like we're seeing turnout go up again. It will be up in France. It will be up across the bloc, presumably. And so what you're seeing is that EU democracy does seem to have having a bit of a moment here. Where even the right-wing and far-right parties, they are calling on their voters to actually show up and to actually engage in this European democratic process. And that is very different from sort of the malaise that we've seen in the European Union in decades up till here.
Yeah, that dovetails perfectly with a point that Hannah Kokelari was just making before you guys came in, that indeed a higher turnout, especially we were looking at the example of the Netherlands, but higher turnout isn't necessarily to the benefit of the pro-European parties. Jamil, as you're looking at these results, what are you thinking as far as the big picture, the big headline that we're going to see on the Politico website tomorrow?
Well, you can see it right now. Obviously, we have a good big headline that Europe is shifting right, driven in particular by France, as I mentioned earlier. The other thing that, apart from turnout, where France it was up, but in other places, some of the smaller countries, we've seen it drop or stay flat. So that is something we'll be definitely watching. It's a bit early because we don't yet have all the numbers. The other thing that will be fascinating will be to see whether Ursula von der Leyen, the incumbent president of the European Commission, whether she can, again, keep her job, basically, whether she can convince 361 members of this next parliament to endorse her as the presumptive next European Commission president. She has, we know, support of many of the national leaders, although not 100% certain support from, say, France. And so the key is whether she can get enough support with this incoming batch of MEPs to secure that role. And the fact that the EPP is doing slightly better under the current exit polls is good news for her. The fact that the parties that have supported her in the past, I just did the numbers on the back of the envelope based on the latest, the parties that have supported her in the past, nearly 400 MEPs under that. That is, we've been saying at Politico, maybe not enough, because if 10% of those 400 don't vote for her, they don't have to. Even if their party votes for her or supports her, those individual MEPs might protest, and even someone in her own bloc might protest, then she could be in trouble. And then it's more rounds, and then there's maybe openings for national leaders to present alternative candidates, which is somewhat how she got in herself last time around.
Indeed, and all this horse trading, has implications for policy. Lawrence, this term was marked by the Green Deal, tech regulation. You're one of you're a cybersecurity editor, so you've been paying a lot of attention to that. How do you see shifts in the policy sphere? So
let me start with the Green Deal, because I think what Jamil just pointed out, Ursula von der Leyen needs 361 votes. As we're seeing it, she has the potential to reach to get there. The question is which are the votes that she's going to add to that tally where she ends up, and the Greens group in the European Parliament is going to be a really interesting player there, because on her right you've got sort of the European Conservatives and Reformists. On her left, it's her sort of in the center, it's the coalition that supported her. But on the left of that, it's the Greens. And so for her, it's going to be a balancing act between how ambitious can her green policy be for the next 5 years versus, what does she lose as she perhaps gives promises to the Greens in order to gain votes. I think looking at the green agenda a little bit more broadly and sort of trying to use our crystal ball into the coming 5 years, I think, and I was just talking to Karl Mathiessen, our senior climate correspondent upstairs, and he said, there was a consensus on climate, and that consensus is now over. And I think that's a good way to put it, is the European Commission has rolled out a major ambitious plan on green policy, but the implementation of that and sort of the last bits to actually complete whatever strategy it wants to use in the coming decades to solve climate change as an issue, that hasn't been solved yet. And she's going to have to be dealing with a very different European Parliament here. Specifically, there's going to be a reform of agriculture policy. There's going to be a question around green issues in agriculture. That right now is an incredibly politically sensitive issue. It's a hot topic that gets the farmers, just on the streets, just outside of our offices. Whoever leads the next European Commission is going to have to balance that. Another one, obviously, is migration. A lot of the parties that we've seen surge in the vote today and in the past couple of days, they profile themselves on migration. The same commission, Ursula von der Leyen's first commission, rolled out the Asylum and Migration Pact. Again, it's about, can you actually implement that? Can you actually get to the point where the European Union is making deals on this externalization of migration policy that it wants to do? So it wants to outsource some of its migration processes. To do all these things, to make essentially the grand program that von der Leyen rolled out in her first mandate, to make that a reality, she will have to navigate a very, very different political environment this time around. And so the question is, first, can she get in the role, and then secondly, will she be able to manage that different political scene?
Just on a very important point Lawrence made about the Greens and the green policy, that was really, in 2019, that was the sort of defining characteristic of this Parliament, this Commission. And if you look in absolute numbers, Renew, the Liberals, have lost slightly more seats than anyone. But if you look on a percentage basis, the Greens have been absolutely crushed. Even so, as we're looking now, I'm going to look at the numbers, make sure I got it right. Right now, Renew, the Liberals, will be down 20 seats, but the Greens will be down 18. But that is from a much smaller base. So you're talking about a much worse showing by the Greens in percentage terms. And that, I think, is very telling. And as you say, we've seen it in the farmers' protests most visibly across Europe, but we've also seen it within some of these parties, the EPP, Ursula von der Leyen's own party, watering down some of the promises made at the beginning of this last mandate. And it'll be very interesting to see how much of the European Green Deal is intact as we go into this next term.
Yeah, and I want to jump in with a question that from Slido that has been sort of indirectly addressed, but I just want to be able to put a fine point on it. This question from Landon, while it's true that the hard right gained locally, overall, isn't it also true that the center, left, and right parties are still likely to hold a majority? Lawrence, can you touch on that and sort of bring in what Jamil has just been talking about of, how has the Kingmaker Party changed?
Yeah,
the tiebreaker party.
That's perhaps the most helpful way to put it. I think what we've seen in the last 5 years is that the Renew Party, which is the most central sort of liberal bloc of seats, really took on the role of kingmaker, and that was because they were in between the two largest parties, the two largest groups, which is European People's Party on the center right and the Socialists and Democrats on the center left, and that was where a majority would usually exist. And we're seeing sort of, the numbers aren't going to skew that much that sort of completely topples that model, but the numbers are skewing in a way that that actually challenges that model, and that the role of kingmaker will likely shift to the right. And I think the interesting part is going to be, how the European People's Party uses that type of chamber. To what extent are they willing to bargain with the hard right, which is sort of the first parties on their right, on certain policies, or how willing are they to extend or to split all the way to the Greens, which is ideologically quite a far split for a lot of members of the European People's Party. What I think will happen is there's a bit of a question as will this be a shock to Parliament work? What we have to understand about the European Parliament is that it is a consensus-building machine. The whole thing is built to get a piece of legislation, to shape it, draft it, work through the text, and at the end, a piece of legislation is voted with quite a substantial majority. We'll likely keep seeing that. We'll likely keep seeing pieces of legislation go through the pipeline and end up being voted with a substantial majority. The question is what happens in the process, and to what extent the right-wing seats can actually influence much more the way that these things are drafted, the way that the texts are being shaped. And I think that's where the action is going to be. It's in the process. And so that's where us as journalists and policy journalists we're going to be looking at.
Really, really helpful. Jamil, let me close down this discussion with you with kind of looking outward. We have elections in the UK coming up in July, and in the United States, Trump versus Biden, maybe a similar dynamic in November. Are there any lessons that election watchers should draw from what's happening tonight here in Europe?
I think it's hard, given the special nature of European Union-level democracy. It's quite hard to draw direct parallels, I would say. In the UK, on July 4th, American Independence Day, coincidentally, the Labour Party is almost certainly going to kick the Tories out after more than a decade in office. So that would be a swing to the left, quite different from what we're definitely seeing in this European election. I guess. So there's no easy parallels to be drawn. I would say just the sort of general vibe, the general malcontents with discontent towards globalization, global elites. This is absolutely part of the same phenomenon that's happening all across the Western world, just at a time when you see the rise of authoritarian challenges in Russia, China, Iran, North Korea, other places. So I think that we're in a particularly tumultuous political time across the Western democracies, and I think you can see that extend, and in the UK that'll be expressed through kicking out the right wing and bringing in the left wing, and in the US it's anyone's guess at this point, but there's a very real chance that Donald Trump is re-elected in November as an expression of this anti-elite, anti-globalization from the have-nots and the people who've missed out.
All right, Jamil, Lawrence, thank you for joining us here at Election Night Live. We'll let you get back to it. And now I'm going to bring in my colleagues Barbara Moons and Eddie Wax. While we're swapping out here in the studio, let me remind you one more time that you can join us on Slido, ask your question at hashtag EU election night. And it's always my favorite thing if you add your name. And Eddie, Barbara,
Hi.
we're both here.
I'm bursting with news. We've just heard
Bursting with news.
that Emmanuel Macron has given a speech in France reacting to some terrible results where the National Rally has resoundingly crushed him. And he has called for a new election of the National Assembly. And it's not a presidential election, but it's the National Assembly. He said there will be a first round of voting on the 30th of June and a second round on July the 7th. So this is really quite cataclysmic in France right now. Yeah.
Reactions. Did we see this coming at all? I mean, we knew things would be bad for Macron, but like not that bad.
Yeah, exactly. We knew that it would be really bad, that Rassemblement National would do really good, as they have, very much so in the preliminary results that we have seen. And also the party of Marine Le Pen has really said that this is not just a European vote, but that they also really see it as a vote of confidence or no confidence on the French government. So Emmanuel Macron himself, and he apparently has now drawn that same conclusion given the really bad results for his party in the European elections. But
it's funny as well because this is not the first time the National Rally has won the elections. I think they've won the European elections the past 2 times. So, but clearly Macron pulling the trigger there on a really quite earth-shattering conclusion. He said in his speech that I just listened to on the radio that it was a heavy decision, a serious decision that he was taking to trigger this special article of the French Constitution, but that it was necessary to kind of have faith and confidence in democracy and the democratic process.
Okay, well, we had some great breaking news, and you can see that we're all very excited about that here at Politico. I want to just take a step back, properly introduce you two. Eddie, you have been our kind of parliament expert, but now you're a co-author on Brussels Playbook. Barbara Moons, you're our chief EU correspondent, and you have both rushed over here from the Parliament and the European People's Party kind of watch party. Can you give us a sense of the mood in those places kind of before we dragged you back to the office? Barbara, you want to get started?
Yeah, I'm happy to start. So we had Ursula von der Leyen, so the lead candidate for the EPP, the European Commission president, who addressed her German party, CDU, earlier this evening. So at that point, we had the preliminary German results, which were quite good for her party. They are holding steady. And so she has addressed them virtually, was very optimistic. We've done well in Germany. Now let's hope that the same goes for the European level. So there was a quite optimistic vibe there at their watch party in the Stanhope Hotel. And she will address the room there now shortly in about 15 minutes again.
Great. Eddie, what was the vibe over at the European Parliament? What was happening there? Like, they're not obviously doing legislating. So it's
more of a watch party. I mean, there's nothing actually happening in the European Parliament. And actually, one of our colleagues, who shall remain nameless, made a funny quip earlier, saying that he's never seen the hemicycle so full because it's only journalists at the moment and kind of press people spinning and trying to put a brave face on sometimes some depressing results. But basically the Parliament has been projecting estimates, figures. Roberta Metsola turned up for about 30 seconds.
President of the
Parliament stepped off a plane from her native Malta and kind of showed us the first kind of projections. It's a projection of the next Parliament, how the hemicycle will look, but it's based I think it's a mixed bag. It's not all based on proper results. Some of it's based on polling because we haven't got kind of results from many of the countries yet.
But what would be interesting, I think, is that we'll have the lead candidates of the different parties there speaking later in the European Parliament, and you can see how the European Parliament itself is really trying to make this a pan-European election, a pan-European event by inviting all these reporters to the Parliament. And
yeah, they're trying to make themselves, they're trying to, kind of host a huge party, a huge event, a huge kind of celebration of the elections themselves. The funny thing was, some of each political group had, a dedicated space in the Parliament. So me and some of our colleagues kind of went along to knock on the door, and it's meant to be for the sort of, it's like a green room. So you're not really meant to go in if you're a journalist, but we knocked on the door, and in the ID group, the far right group, there was no one there. So we were joking about that, and then I called the ID spokesperson, and they were saying, look, they didn't give us a very good spot in the parliament. No one was going to come and see us anyway, so we're coming to the people. I'm going around, I'm meeting people where they are. It's a fun atmosphere.
See if that changes. Yeah. Well, we have a lot of questions on Slido from people who really want to get a sense of what's coming up next. So I'm gonna ask a couple of those. But before I get to, I'm searching for a good one that I just saw. So Hugo Blewett Mundy asked, what will the rightward shift mean for the EU enlargement agenda? Barbara, can you tackle that one?
That's a good question. So far, we have been very focused on the European Council when it comes to enlargement, especially obviously given Hungary's objections to moving really fast when it comes to the accession of Ukraine and Moldova. If this shift to the right in the European Parliament that we're seeing now in the projections continues, we can expect more pushback from the European Parliament as well on those next steps. So far, the European Parliament has been pretty proactive and pretty supportive for enlargement, Ukraine, Moldova, but also Western Balkans. So that might change, and that matters because the next 5 years will be really important when it comes to the next steps. If you don't give further concrete steps, further hope towards those different countries, then that process may stall, and those countries may turn back towards Russia, of course.
And of course, supporting Ukraine has been a huge plank of sort of Ursula von der Leyen's, a huge part of her first mandate. It was a huge part of her pitch for a second term as commission president. Eddie, based on the results that you're seeing, is she still kind of the presumptive next commission president, or is she more at risk?
Well, I think we have been right to be talking about this as a big topic for the last, maybe month or so, because totting up the numbers before, just in the parliament, before I rushed over here, I mean, if you put together the kind of classic majority which has kind of underpinned her for the last 5 years, so that's her own European People's Party, then the Socialists and Democrats, and then Renew, you only really get up to 398 votes. And some people might be thinking, well, that's fine, because you only need 361. So she has a bit of a margin there. But actually, every time this vote every 5 years comes around on the Commission President, you lose. You tend to lose. Of course, you lose the far right. Of course, you lose the far left. Sometimes you don't get the Greens. Sometimes you don't get some of the hard right. But you even also lose some of the people from your own camp. So 10 to 15% kind of bleeds away. So with 398, that's not enough. I think the question now is, obviously, are those estimates accurate? We'll see more about that later tonight. But also, can the European People's Party and those other two, political groupings bring in new parties and bump up their own numbers by doing deals, by offering, nice jobs to, who knows, the new kind of face of the Hungarian opposition who wants to join the EPP. Can they bring them in? Can they do the same with other parties around Europe and give von der Leyen, if she is nominated, a bit of a boost there?
In the council, Barbara, what's your sense of how this will affect von der Leyen's chances among European leaders?
I think what's definitely a first kind of takeaway from these preliminary results is Scholz and Macron, right? We have a very weakened Macron, as we have just discussed, who will have to face up its mess internally in France. Of course, it's still France, and his vote still matters very much in the European Council, but other leaders know that he's weakened internally. That will play a role. The same goes for Olaf Scholz, the German chancellor, whose party did bad into the preliminary results that we have seen at this point. So you have those kinds of two leaders who are already, the big Franco axis was already not there anymore, but they have both been weakened by these results. So that gives more leverage, more power for others when it comes, for example, Italy, for example, Poland. So when the discussion will come, will we nominate Ursula von der Leyen again as European Commission President? We definitely have to look at those other heads of state and government as well. And also, obviously, taking into account the results that we are seeing this far. So when it comes to Meloni, for example, her
Italian Prime Minister, head of the European Conservatives and Reformists.
So she will get a boost from these European Parliament results, mentally, in terms of power that she brings to the European Council table.
And we also have a lot of interest in top jobs. the council presidency is up for grabs. Head of EU foreign policy. Do these results kind of affect that thinking? And I want to throw in one specific question from Slido from Mateusz Mazzini, who asks if Radek Sikorski, currently the foreign minister of Poland, has a chance to get a top EU job. And if yes, which one? As you mentioned, Poland, might be a more important player.
Maybe just to start with the results that we saw so far. So EPP and SND so far are relatively stable in terms of their numbers, right? So as the two biggest groups in the European Parliament, that gives them really kind of the prerogative to put forward their names. So we have Ursula von der Leyen as lead candidate. And then for the socialists, there was a lot of talk about the former Portuguese Prime Minister Antonio Costa as the potential future European Council president, that would be kind of, the basis of a deal between those two big groups in the European Parliament. Based on these results that we are seeing now, that is still possible. And then the rest of the puzzle can fill from there. Of course, this is all talk at this point. It will depend on the conversations that leaders will have in the coming hours, days, and weeks, probably. Specifically on Sikorski, yes, he is definitely mentioned for the top jobs. Obviously, he was the most mentioned as defense commissioner, but what we've heard in most recent days and weeks is that defense commissioner might not actually be enough of a job for him, given there is no budget, a lot of limited authority. It sounds very fancy, but in terms of authority within the commission, it's fairly limited. So he could also be one potential candidate to become the EU foreign policy chief, succeeding Josep Borrell. But of course, everything depending on the rest of the package, given that we need a balance in geography, gender, political affiliation, and other things.
Yeah, always super, super complicated. Eddie, can you walk us through the next steps and some key dates that we should be looking out for?
Well, I'm just trying to survive the night, but looking forward to looking to next week. I mean, that's when I think we'll start, seeing that von der Leyen will be having phone calls with other European leaders who will want to know from her. They want to know how does she feel about the numbers. They'll want to tell her what they want in the next commission. Then I think the next kind of key date after the sort of G7 meeting, which I think is towards the end of next week, where I'm sure there'll be discussions in the margins about kind of interpreting the results. Then in terms of the European Council, after that, we're looking at the 17th of June. That's the next kind of key moment where Charles Michel, the president of the European Council, will convene a kind of informal dinner. It's not going to be an official European Council as far as we understand, correct me if I'm wrong, but just kind of a dinner between the 27 heads of government, heads of state, and they will, chew over the results of the election. I don't think they will come out with any names at that point, but they will kind of have an agreement on maybe a package of, S&D gets this, EPP gets this. And I think Charles Michel has been very clear that he wants to wrap this whole thing up by the end of June. And at the end of June, 27th, 28th, I believe, there's a full-blown European Council, and that is basically when they will need to kind of come out with a name. The other kind of key dates is, what's on everyone's mind is, is it July or is it September? And that refers to the parliamentary vote, the European Parliament vote on the Commission President. So, do they feel comfortable enough to put her in the hot seat in Strasbourg in July? Do they need to wait? Do they need to have more time? I mean, the argument from kind of her campaign team has, and people, close to her has been, the world's unstable, and that's one of the key, cards that they carry, basically. One of their key arguments is that we want to have stability in the European Union. We don't want to have, Trump getting into the White House with the EU still sorting out its top leadership team, over the winter and into early next year. So, delaying the president vote until September really means you don't really have the commissioner hearings until maybe October, November. It starts to become kind of, next year that you start having the commission actually taking office, which is quite insane given that, we're only in June now. So, there would be arguments to kind of put her in the spotlight in July, I think.
All right, chaos in perpetuity. Barbara, quickly, we're going to wrap up with you. Ursula von der Leyen, Commission President, is kind of hard to read, kind of inscrutable, but you've been spending a lot of time with her. An unfair question to end on, but to the extent that you can imagine what is in her mind, what do you think she's thinking right now as she's looking at these results coming in?
If only we knew. No, I did spend a lot of time with her on the campaign trail, which showed a different von der Leyen than we know, right? We know her as the very, formal European Commission president, and there she had to go out campaigning, talking to normal people, having a much smaller team, which also allowed for a bit more access. She is, as we know, uber prepared, to use a German expression, very professional. So, the way that I've seen her is especially focus. So doing a lot of different things, as Eddie said, talking to all those leaders, talking to their people, at the same time also reaching out to the European Parliament, all the different groups, while at the same time also as European Commission President going to the G7 on Thursday to negotiate about frozen assets, then to the peace conference in Switzerland to talk about peace in Ukraine. So a lot of different games of chess that she'll be playing at the same time this week.
All right, games of chess are what we will be playing, and I'll let you two get back to it, but just sit here with me for a few more minutes as I say thanks to both you, Eddie and Barbara, and to all of our other guests tonight, Jamil Androlini, Henna Kokalere, and Lauren Saroulis. Thanks to you for watching. We hope you've enjoyed Politico's Election Night Live. This has also been a live taping of Politico's EU Confidential podcast. So if you haven't already, be sure to follow or subscribe on your favorite podcast app. Every week, we'll continue to follow the outcomes of this election and all these chess games, whatever it means for the EU moving forward. I'm Sarah Wheaton. A big thanks to the team behind this live video podcast and to our producers, Diana Sturis and Christina Gonzalez. Our coverage will continue on our live blog at politico.eu, so stay with us online. Have a good night.